Hey, I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and in this week's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do watercolor lettering and blending with liquid watercolors. Let's jump right in. All right, so first thing as always is tools. And first up we have the watercolor paper. So this is just Strathmore cold pressed watercolor paper. There are different types of watercolor paper. You'll see it on the cover all the time. So cold press is like a grittier one. You have hot press that's a little bit smoother, and then there's rough press. My preference is cold press because it's gritty enough that it'll hold the watercolor and you'll still be able to get blends, but it's not super smooth, so it's not like totally all blending all over the place. So cold press is great for what we're doing here. Then obviously you have your paints. So in this video I'm using liquid watercolor. These are by a company called Royal Talons and the paints are called Eco Line. And I'm actually just using 3 colors, so blue, yellow, and pink. I find these blend really nicely together, but you can use whatever colors you want as long as you've tested them and make sure they don't make like a mucky, ugly brown or anything. These are wonderful. But you can also use tubed watercolors. My favorites are Winsor & Newton. So there's the Cotman series, which is a little bit cheaper, or the actual professional series. These are great. They just require you to put them down into a pan and then mix a lot of water into them to make them blend enough. And so I find them a little bit more challenging for what we're doing today. So if you have access to liquid watercolor, they're great. If not, you can use these and just make sure you add a lot of water to them. Then we have a brush. My favorite is this Princeton Snap brush. It comes in lots of different sizes, and it's just a really nice round brush. So round is great for watercolor and for lettering, and so that's my favorite. Any round brush really is fine, and you can use a different size if you like. I like about this size, which is a 0. You can get it a little bit bigger if you like, if you have a heavier hand or if you like writing bigger. But for what I'm doing today, this size works perfectly for me. You could also use these water brushes. So these are by Pentel and Kuretake. And these you fill up with water and you can dip them right into your paints, and then you have water right on the brush. The tips on these are quite a bit bigger and I find them a little bit harder to control. So I prefer to use an actual paintbrush, but if you're on the go, these are really, really handy. No pun intended. And then paper towel and a glass of water. And that's pretty much all you're going to need for this tutorial. The first thing you're going to want to do is come up with your design. And for the sake of keeping this video short and sweet, I've already drawn my design onto my watercolor paper. If you need help with any layout related calligraphy and lettering stuff, I've got a video for that. So you can click up here and flip over to that one first if you need help with it. But I've just written really, really lightly. I've written Better Together, which is a song I really like. And I've kind of centered it in my page. Now, the one thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing your layout onto watercolor paper and you're doing it in pencil first, which you don't have to, by the way, if you're fine doing the lettering without pencil, that's great. But if you do it in pencil first, you want to make sure it's really, really, really light. Because if you're using any light colors like this yellow I'm going to use, you'll be able to see the pencil through it, and you can't erase pencil underneath watercolor. So make sure it's really light. And so you can probably barely see my writing on this page, which is perfect, but I'm actually going to even use an eraser and kind of get rid of a little bit more of that graphite. So you want to have just enough graphite on there that you can see it, but you don't want to be able to see it through your paint. So once you have your layout drawn, you're going to jump in and start lettering. So you want to be rotating through these colors basically after every stroke. And so every time you lift up your brush, and if you've never done calligraphy before, this is probably a little bit too advanced for you, and I've got lots of beginner videos you can watch on this. But essentially in between every stroke, when you lift your paintbrush up, you're going to switch colors. And you want to make sure, your biggest thing you want to make sure of when you're doing this is that your paint stays wet as you work. So you want to load a lot of paint onto there. You want to make sure it's really wet as you're working so that the colors blend nicely together. So I'm just going to go ahead with my blue first, and I'm not wetting my paintbrush first. I'm just dipping right into the blue, making sure there's lots of paint on there. And I'm going to do my first letter, or my first stroke. So as I come towards the bottom of my B here, because I'm using a small brush, you can see that I've sort of run out of paint. So I'm just going to dip back in and add some more. And you want almost like a puddle of paint. Now, if you're finding it hard to get a ton of paint on there, you can also put some water onto your brush first and then dip in and just keep dabbing more paint onto your stroke. So the most important part to make sure that there's a lot of paint is that bottom corner where you're about to start your next stroke. So once you've done that first one, you're going to take your brush, wipe it off in the water, and then dip into your next color, which in this case is going to be yellow. So put lots onto your brush and then start in that corner, just touch it to the blue and you'll see some bleeds starting to happen. And then as you move down your letter, it'll go back to yellow. So as you start to touch your colors together, they'll make extra colors. So we've got a green happening here, and you can just kind of squish it around the rest of your letter, and you can even tap it a little bit further up into the blue one. And then generally, like if this gets a little bit mucky, which it did here, you can't really tell that it's super bright green. You can actually take your paper towel, just a corner of it, and kind of dab a little bit of the color out. So now it looks a little less brown and a little more vibrant green. And then you can take your paintbrush back into that yellow and add a little more yellow so it's a bit brighter in here. And same thing as you move down toward the bottom of that bee, I also want this yellow to stay wet like we talked about earlier. And I want it to be a bit brighter. So I'm going to add a little more here as I move towards the next stroke. And I really want to make sure that this is nice and yellow before I add my pink to it. Otherwise it's going to blend with the green, and that's not a nice mix if you've ever done any color theory. So I've got my yellow all set up here, and I'm going to dip into my pink and add my pink stroke. And again, you can see some of that yellow starting to bleed into the pink. And if you want it to be a little more vibrant with the yellow, you can just tap a little more into here. Again, make sure that your pink at this last stroke is really nice and saturated. And then you can move on to the blue again. So you can do these in any order that you want. I don't always do them in perfect 1, 2, 3, like blue, yellow, pink, blue, yellow, pink. You can kind of play it by ear. I really love the way that the pink and the blue mesh together. So again, just making sure it's nice and wet wherever you're going to have another stroke coming in. And I'm going to put that crossbar for the T up here in a second. And same thing down here, you want to make sure this is nice and saturated. And I'm going to cross my T with yellow. And I just really like how that bleed already works, so I'm not even going to touch it. I'm going to make the next T yellow as well. And again, I really like the way that this blended at the bottom here. So all I'm going to do is add a little bit more yellow in that corner to make it nice and saturated, where I'm going to add my E. And because this color is already a little bit green, I'm going to add blue next, because I know that if I add my pink to that green, it's going to turn out brown. So this is where starting to understand the color theory is really helpful. Knowing what colors mix well and which ones don't together. Make sure the end here is really saturated. And then I'm going to do pink. I love the way these two colors mix together. It makes a really beautiful purple. And because this is already so dark and purple, I'm going to just add another pink that's a little more vibrant down here. And again, add a little more, just the solid pink at the bottom. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing for my next word. Now you can choose to follow the same kind of color pattern you did from left to right here, or you can totally change it up. So I'm actually going to totally change it. I'm going to start with pink over here. And And that's about it for the letters. Lastly, if you want to add a little bit of detail to this, you can go over some of the colors. Again, if you feel like there are spots that should be brighter, you can add a little bit more, but I am really happy with the way that this coloring turned out. And so the last step that I want to do is actually just add a couple of little like paint splatters. So all you're going to do is dip your paintbrush into the color and then give it a little shake on top. Sometimes this makes a little bit of a mess, so you want to kind of make sure that you have like your desk protected. And I actually don't really care if the paint ends up on any of my letters because I find it gives it a little fun effect. If you wanted to, you could protect your letters too though. And I'm going to switch colors. And one last one in pink. And that's it.